High in the quiet hills of Oregon, an old man lived alone in a wooden cabin, certain his story had ended with the long, cold winters. But one morning, a knock on his door changed everything. On the porch sat a wooden crate, and inside something that would steal his silence forever. It wasn't a cat. It wasn't a wild beast. It was a talking bobcat. And that's where this story begins. The cabin had learned to be quiet without being sad. It sat at the edge of the Oregon woods like an old dog keeping watch. Cedar shingles grayed by rain and time, porch boards smoothed by 1,000 steps that had mostly stopped. Most mornings, George Miller took his coffee to the front steps and listened to the wind move through the firs. On still days, he could hear the creek farther down the hill, a steady whisper that said something like, "Keep going, keep going." He liked that sound. It didn't ask him questions. He was 72 now, the kind of 72 that wore flannel because it was warm and kept a pocket knife because you never knew. He'd been an aerospace engineer down in California once, the man people called when a bolt shouldn't rattle but did, when a panel should hum but didn't. Those were tidy problems with tidy fixes. Then life gave him one that wasn't. After the funeral 4 years ago, he drove north until the mountains felt close enough to lean on. And he stayed. Inside, the house had the habits of a pair, even though only one person lived there. A second mug hung beside his on the hook. He left it there because the empty space looked worse. On the mantel, a photo showed him and Ruth in their Sunday clothes the year they paid off the cabin. Her hair was the color of winter wheat, her eyes the kind that made waitresses sneak her extra pie. The glass caught morning light and threw it across the room, and most days George let it, as if the sun needed help getting in. Neighbors came by when they had reason. Mabel from 2 lots over brought pie in a tin that had seen as many summers as she had. She was 68 and brisk, a widow who kept busy enough to stay upright. She would hand him apple or peach and say, "I made too much." And he would say, "Lucky me." And they would stand on the porch a moment longer than strangers. She teased him about the radio he kept tuned to the old standards. He teased her about the rooster clock in her kitchen that crowed on the hour, and sometimes not at all. These small conversations were steady as fence posts. When she walked back down the path, he watched until she turned out of sight and then went inside. That Tuesday started without a complaint. He fed the stove and set the kettle on. He split 2 rounds of fur left from a pile that had been too high in October and was now just right. He shuffled a deck of cards on the table and played a game Ruth had taught him, the kind where you build little houses of red and black and forgive yourself for cheating. In the afternoon, he carried out a rocker he had found on the curb 30 years ago and fixed the slats on with fresh screws. He sanded the arm until it felt like the back of Ruth's hand. Little jobs like that were a way to count time without worrying where it went. Near 3 o'clock, the phone rang. It was the landline, the one that almost no one used anymore. He lifted the receiver like it might bite and said, "George," because he didn't need to say more. The voice on the other end was his son, Tom, heavier in the throat than when he was a boy, always halfway between the man he'd become and the kid who showed up late for dinner. "Hey, Dad. How's my favorite hermit?" Tom said. "Still hermit," George said. "Coffee's good, stove's behaving. Truck starts on the first turn. You make it sound like a miracle." Some days it is. There was a second voice in the background, high and eager. "Is that Grandpa?" Ethan, 10 years old and loud with life, had a way of speaking like the words might outrun him if he didn't hold on. "That's him," Tom said. "We were thinking of coming up tomorrow. You got room for 2 troublemakers?" "I'll clear the decks," George said. He meant he'd move the mail off the second chair. He meant he'd sweep the porch and set out the blue enamel cups Ethan liked for Coco. "You staying for supper?" "If you'll have us," Tom said, then hesitated. "Ethan's excited. He, wants to show you something." "What kind of something?" "The kind that might need a little grandpa wisdom," Tom said. It could have been anything. A school project that went sideways, a fishing pole that needed mending, a heart that needed steadying. George said, "Bring it," and that ended that. He hung up and stood a long time with the receiver in his hand, the dial tone buzzing like a fly. He set it down and looked at the second mug. He washed both mugs and flipped them upside down to dry. He took the broom to the porch, and the porch obliged. He found a bag of marshmallows that had gone hard at the top and soft in the middle, and decided Ethan would appreciate the challenge. Near dusk, he walked down to the creek in his old boots, the ones with clay packed in the treads, and watched the water shove past rocks that didn't care. He breathed easier near moving things. Fog came in off the hills after dark, the kind that presses up against the windows and makes the world smaller. George turned on the lamp beside the couch, as if the lamp might comfort the night. He heated a bowl of stew from the freezer and ate it with a spoon bent at the handle so it lay right in his hand. After, he brought the photo of Ruth to the table and sat with it while the kettle sighed. He didn't talk to the picture because he wasn't crazy. And anyway, Ruth had always been the listener. He just sat, and the room settled around him the way a coat settles on shoulders that remember its weight. When sleep came, it came honest. He woke before dawn to a sky the color of wet slate and the smell of wood smoke sitting low in the room. He set the kettle on again and cracked the door to taste the air. The cold had that metallic edge that said snow wouldn't be a surprise, though the calendar said it was early. He dressed in layers, because habits like that keep a man alive. He set 2 extra logs by the stove and stacked more near the door. He wasn't expecting trouble, but he knew better than to be surprised by it. By mid-morning, the sun showed itself between clouds, thin and brave. George swept off the steps again just to have something to do with his hands. Somewhere in the trees, a woodpecker tried to knock a hole in the day. He smiled at the insistence. When the truck finally turned into the drive, he heard it before he saw it. Tires on gravel, the sound of people coming. Tom climbed out first and stretched like a man who'd driven too far. Ethan spilled out next, all arms and elbows, a cap with a cartoon fish pulled low. They waved like town parade royalty, and George waved back because you can't not wave when somebody waves like that. Then he saw the thing in the bed of the truck. It looked like a crate. Not big but solid, slats and mesh. The sort of box you use when the thing inside shouldn't be loose. A blanket was thrown over part of it, the corner pinned with a bungee cord. Something under the blanket moved in a way that wasn't the wind. George felt his throat tighten in that old way from the plant when somebody rolled the wrong cart into the wrong bay. "What's all this?" he asked, aiming for light and landing in wary. "Before you get mad," Tom said, hands up. "Hear me out. When did I get mad before you finished talking?" "Any time between 98 and now." Ethan was already at the tailgate, fingers on the latch. "Grandpa, wait till you see. He's perfect." "He?" George said, and the word hung there. Tom dropped the tailgate slow, like he'd practiced. The blanket slid enough to show mesh, then eyes. Amber eyes, watchful and steady, too calm to be any kind of ordinary. The shape behind the mesh was cat and not cat. Large paws tucked in, ears with little brushes at the tips like ink flicks. Spots along tawny fur that caught the light. Not bright, but certain. The animal gave a small, throaty sound that wasn't a growl and wasn't a purr. It sounded, to George's surprise, like a question. Ethan grinned so big, his face might split. "Grandpa, this is Buddy." George looked from the box to his son. "You brought me a wildcat," he said, not angry so much as amazed. The air seemed thinner. All the quiet in the woods leaned in. Tom scratched his neck, that old tell when he was about to ask for too much. "It's a long story," he said. "Short version, roadside rescue. Center's over capacity. They need a place for a few weeks, tops. I told them we'd ask you. He's young, hurt his paw a little. Calm and these things go." "These things," George said, because sometimes repeating a phrase gives you time to understand it. The animal made that sound again, like a careful hello. It didn't blink. It just looked. And something in George answered in a part of him that hadn't been spoken to in a while. Ethan tugged his sleeve. "He's not scary, Grandpa. He talks. Not words, but like, you'll see." "Talks," George said, and heard the gravel in his own voice. He had expected cocoa and cards and maybe fixing the reel on a fishing pole. He had not expected this. Tom put a hand on the crate, gentle. "If you say no, we turn around and figure out something else. I mean that. But I thought, well, Ethan thought, you might like the company, just for a while." A breeze came up from the creek and brought the smell of wet leaves and cold stone. George felt it in his chest and in his hands, and in the small place behind his ribs where fear and hope live close together. He thought of the second cup on the hook and the photo on the mantel and the way the chair had felt smooth under his palm. He thought of the quiet that wasn't sad, and how sometimes it was, anyway. The animal shifted and made a soft series of notes, chittering like a finch, and then something else, a little trill that rose and fell. It wasn't a sound the woods made. It wasn't a sound the house made. It was a sound that belonged to itself, offered out like a handshake. George surprised himself by laughing, not loud but with edges that felt new. He put his hand on the crate the way you do when you want to steady something and yourself at the same time. "Well, Buddy," he said, the name finding an easy spot in his mouth, "I guess we're going to have a talk." Behind him, the door stood open to a room with 2 chairs. The kettle clicked as metal cooled. Somewhere far off, thunder grumbled in the mountains as if to clear its throat. And for the first time in a long while, the cabin did not feel like it was waiting. It felt like it was about to listen. The morning air carried the smell of pine and damp earth, the kind of scent that reminded George of his childhood when his father used to take him camping near Crater Lake. Only this time, instead of tents and canoes, there was a wooden crate sitting square in the middle of his porch, covered with a gray blanket that quivered every few seconds. The sound coming from inside wasn't a meow, not really. It was deeper. Something between a growl and a mumble, like an engine deciding whether to start. Ethan stood next to it with the pride of a magician revealing his best trick. "He's friendly, Grandpa, I promise." "Friendly," George repeated, raising an eyebrow. "That's one word for it." Tom, ever the practical one, lifted the corner of the blanket. "Go on, Dad. Take a look." George bent forward, careful, like a man inspecting a fuse that might still be live. 2 golden eyes blinked up at him from the shadows, bright and clear, framed by black markings that gave the creature an almost quizzical expression. The tufted ears twitched once. Then came the sound again, a low chatter, quick, inquisitive. Ethan grinned so wide his missing front tooth showed. "See? He's talking to you." "Talking, huh?" Sounds more like arguing. The animal shifted its weight, stretching one paw through the mesh before pulling it back again. Its fur was tawny, spotted, and thicker around the neck. Not a kitten, not a cat. George's mind flipped through memories like a Rolodex, wildlife magazines, news clips, ranger signs on hiking trails. "Tom," he said slowly, "that's a bobcat." Tom nodded. Rescue center found him after a storm took out part of the highway. Mom fox was gone, but the cub survived. They're short on fosters and, well, he paused, knowing his father's look. "You've got the space and the quiet." George chuckled once, short and dry. "That's one way of putting it." Ethan crouched beside the crate. "They said his name's Buddy, but I told them Grandpa should decide." "Buddy works fine," George said. He wasn't sure why he said it. Maybe it was the way the animal was studying him, steady, cautious, curious, as if trying to decide what kind of human he was. Tom carried the crate inside, setting it near the fireplace. "They gave us everything: food, a small litter tray, a blanket. He's used to people. You won't have to worry about him clawing the curtains." George gave a quiet laugh. "Tom, I don't have curtains." "Even better," Tom said. The room warmed quickly from the stove, the scent of cedar filling the air. George poured coffee for everyone, including a small bowl of water for Buddy, who was still in the crate but had begun to hum in a strange rhythmic way. Ethan pressed close to the mesh. "Grandpa, can we let him out?" George hesitated. Maybe give him time to get used to things. Buddy seemed to have other ideas. The latch clicked. George swore he hadn't touched it, and the crate door eased open. The bobcat stepped out with surprising grace, landing soft on the rug like he'd done it 100 times. He sniffed the air, flicked his ears, and then padded toward George's chair. "Hey now," George said, backing up half an inch. "That's private property." Buddy stopped, looked at him, and let out a short, rising trill that sounded suspiciously like a chuckle. Ethan clapped his hands. "He likes you already." "Yeah," George said. "That's what worries me." The next few minutes unfolded like a small domestic comedy. Buddy inspected the table legs, the old bookshelf, the newspaper pile. He hopped onto the arm of the chair and stared out the window, tail twitching as if judging the birds outside. When George tried to nudge him off, Buddy responded with a soft sound, half protest, half purr, and sat down again, as if the discussion were settled. Tom shook his head. "Looks like you've been voted out of your own chair." George leaned back and sighed. "Guess I'll stand." Builds character. Ethan spent the afternoon helping his grandfather set up a corner for Buddy. A small rug near the hearth, a water bowl, a box filled with soft rags. Buddy observed the process from the armchair, occasionally offering commentary in a series of chirps and snorts that made Ethan laugh so hard he nearly spilled the water. Later, when Tom went outside to make a phone call, George found himself alone with the creature. The room had gone still except for the faint ticking of the clock and the occasional crack of sap in the wood stove. Buddy turned his head toward him, eyes catching the light. "So," George said softly, "you're the new tenant?" Buddy answered with a low warble that rose at the end like a question. "Yeah, me too," George murmured. He wasn't sure what made him say it, but the words slipped out before he could stop them. When Tom and Ethan packed up to leave that evening, Ethan knelt by Buddy and whispered, "Take care of Grandpa, okay?" Buddy pressed his forehead to the boy's hand, then looked up at George as if he understood. Tom loaded the truck, then paused at the driver's side door. "You'll call if it's too much?" George nodded. "If he starts building rockets or running for office, you'll be the first to know." Tom laughed. but there was worry behind it. He waved once, then drove down the long gravel path until the taillights vanished among the trees. The cabin felt different after they left. Quieter, but not the kind of quiet that presses on your chest. George closed the door and turned toward the room. Buddy was sitting in front of the fireplace, tail wrapped neatly around his paws, watching him with that same bright curiosity. "You're something, aren't you?" George said. Buddy blinked slowly, then chirped twice, sharp, quick notes that sounded like agreement. "Well," George sighed, lowering himself into the other chair. "If you're staying, we'd better get some ground rules." Buddy tilted his head, ears flicking. "Number 1, no sleeping on my bed." A low musical trill. "Number 2, that chair is mine." Another chirp, higher this time, almost mocking. George couldn't help laughing. "Yeah, this is going to go real smooth." Outside, the wind picked up, brushing the porch like soft fingers. The fire cracked, throwing a thin line of light across Buddy's face. The bobcat made a sound deep in his throat, almost like a hum, and laid his head on his paws. His eyes drooped, but didn't close completely. Still watching, still aware. George sat there a long while, the warmth from the stove settling into his bones. It had been years since anyone, or anything, had shared this space with him and made it feel alive. He thought about what Tom had said, about the rescue center calling back in a few weeks, for reasons he couldn't quite name. The thought of giving Buddy back already felt like losing something he hadn't known he needed. Before turning in, he switched off the lamp and stood by the window. Snow had started falling, slow, lazy flakes drifting through the dark. He looked back at the bobcat curled near the fire, chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. "Good night, Buddy," he whispered. The bobcat stirred, eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, and let out a soft, almost human sound. A small murmur that carried through the room like a reply. George smiled in the dark. "You really do think you're family, don't you?" Buddy's tail flicked once in answer. And for the first time in years, when George climbed into bed, the silence of the cabin didn't feel empty. It felt like company. Morning slid through the cabin windows in soft ribbons of gold. It was the kind of light that warmed the dust and made everything look like it had been waiting to be seen. George woke to the faint sound of something that was not the kettle, not the clock, and not the wind. It was a rolling, rhythmic chirping, half hum, half conversation, coming from the living room. He shuffled down the hallway, still in his flannel robe, and stopped in the doorway. There, sitting proudly on the arm of his recliner like a furry king, was Buddy. The bobcat's tail flicked lazily, while his amber eyes tracked George's every move. The moment George appeared, Buddy let out a long trill, the tone almost scolding. "Well, good morning to you too," George muttered. Buddy chirped again, higher this time, as if repeating the greeting back at him. George laughed under his breath. "You've got opinions already, huh?" He poured himself coffee, and the sound of the percolator made Buddy perk up, ears twitching like satellite dishes. When George sat at the table, Buddy hopped down with the silent grace of something that had never stumbled a day in its life. The bobcat padded across the floor and parked himself exactly 3 feet away. Eyes bright, paws tucked neatly, posture straight as a soldier. "Don't even think about it," George warned, spoon halfway to his mouth. Buddy leaned forward, made a soft warble, and then, just as George lifted his spoon again, raised one paw in perfect imitation, as if asking to join him. "Now hold on," George said, chuckling. "You can't eat oatmeal, you're a cat." Well, not exactly a cat, but still. Buddy made a short huff that somehow sounded like disagreement. Then, as if to underline his point, he climbed up onto the empty chair opposite George and sat there like a dinner guest waiting to be served. George nearly spit his coffee. "You've got nerve, I'll give you that." The cabin filled with small, odd sounds that day. Rustling, soft thumps. Buddy's rolling chatter that seemed to match every word George spoke. By mid-morning, the two of them had fallen into a kind of rhythm. George would talk, mostly to himself, and Buddy would answer in tones that always seemed just right. Sometimes curious, sometimes indignant, sometimes perfectly amused. When Mabel showed up around noon with her usual pie tin, she nearly dropped it. "George Miller, what in heaven's name is that doing on your table?" Buddy was sitting right in the middle of the kitchen table, one paw resting on a newspaper like he was waiting for the sports section. George grinned. "Mabel, meet Buddy, my grandson in training." Mabel blinked. "Grandson?" "He thinks he is anyhow. Talks like one too." Buddy turned to her, trilled twice, then reached out and tapped the pie tin with one paw. Mabel yelped. "He's complimenting your baking," George said, deadpan. Mabel gave him a look that could have curdled cream. "You've lost your mind." "Maybe," George said, "but at least it's good company." She left after half an hour, shaking her head but smiling. George caught her looking back once from the edge of the porch, her expression softening before she turned away. That night, after the dishes were done, Buddy took up residence on the arm of George's recliner again. The old man had turned on the news, though he wasn't really watching it. The anchor's voice droned on about markets and storms and politics. Buddy's ears flicked each time the tone changed, and finally he made a sharp chirp that sounded suspiciously like disapproval. "Yeah," George said. "I don't like him either." Buddy responded with another noise, a chitter that sounded almost like laughter. "You're something else," George murmured, scratching behind one of the tufted ears. The bobcat leaned into the touch, closing his eyes halfway, purring in a deep, throaty rhythm that filled the room with an odd kind of peace. Later, as the fire burned low, George found himself talking again. Really talking. He told Buddy about the old days at the plant, about Ruth's garden, about how quiet the house got after she was gone. He hadn't spoken those words to anyone in years. Buddy didn't interrupt. He just sat there, eyes half-lidded, occasionally letting out a soft trill as if to say, "I'm listening." When George paused, Buddy made one of those peculiar bobcat sounds, a kind of rolling growl that ended in a chirp. "You're agreeing with me, aren't you?" George said, smiling faintly. "You always do." He dozed off in that chair with Buddy curled on the rug beside him, the steady pulse of the purring blending with the crackle of the fire. The next morning, George woke to the smell of coffee and found Buddy sitting on the kitchen counter, staring at the pot like it owed him something. "You brewing today?" George asked. The bobcat chirped twice and swiped gently at the cabinet where the cups were kept. "Yeah, I get it," George said. "We've got our routine now." When the knock came at the door around noon, George opened it to find Tom standing there with a paper bag of groceries. "Figured you could use a few things." He stopped mid-sentence when Buddy trotted up beside George, tail high, making a sound like greeting an old friend. Tom's eyebrows shot up. You let him out?" "He let himself out," George said. "Seems he runs the place now." Tom stared for a long moment, then chuckled. "He looks healthy." "He eats better than I do," George replied. "Mabel's been bringing him pie." "Pie?" "Apple, his favorite." Tom sighed and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Dad, he's still wild. You can't treat him like a house cat." Buddy made a low, rumbling noise, one ear flicking toward Tom, the other toward George, as if following the conversation. George crossed his arms. Seems to me he's more polite than most folks I know. Tom exhaled, half amused, half defeated. Just promise me you'll be careful. I'm 72, George said. Careful's the only speed I've got left. After Tom left, George watched from the porch as Buddy prowled through the thin layer of snow that had settled overnight. The Bobcat paused now and then to look back, as if making sure George was watching. Go on, George called. You've got the whole world out there. Buddy chirped once and bounded after a drifting leaf, paws kicking up soft white powder. That night, the fire burned higher. George fixed himself a bowl of stew and poured a bit of broth into a smaller dish for Buddy, who lapped it up with delicate precision. The old man leaned back, feeling something in his chest that had been missing for years. Contentment, maybe, or just the sound of another heartbeat in the room. You really do think you're my grandson, don't you? He said. Buddy looked up, whiskers shining in the firelight, and made a short, decisive murr, the kind of sound that didn't leave room for argument. George chuckled softly. Fine, you win. But if you're my grandson, that means you do chores. The Bobcat tilted his head, then flopped onto his side with a low rumble that sounded suspiciously like laughter. George laughed too, the sound echoing off the cabin walls. The place that had once been filled with silence now rang with something warm and alive. Outside, the moon climbed above the trees, silvering the snow and the roof of the little house. Inside, an old man and a wild cat dozed near the fire, their breathing falling into the same slow rhythm, two hearts learning without words that family doesn't always need to be born. It can be found, and sometimes it has spots. By late November, the snow had come and gone twice, dusting the roof and the porch like powdered sugar before melting back into the earth. The mornings carried that thin, biting chill that made every step on the floorboards creak louder. George had grown used to the rhythm, his boots by the stove, the coffee pot hissing at 6, and Buddy waiting on the mirror rug like an impatient roommate. Each morning now began with conversation. George would shuffle to the counter, grumble about the cold, and Buddy would answer with a chirp that always sounded like, I told you to buy thicker socks. One Tuesday, George decided enough was enough. You've got to learn some manners, kid, he said. If you're going to live here, you need to know the rules. Buddy blinked slowly from his perch on the kitchen counter, tail swaying like a metronome. That's right, George said, wagging a finger. Grandpa's school of decent behavior starts today. The Bobcat gave a long, drawn-out trill that might have been laughter. George pointed toward the chair across from him. Lesson 1, chairs are for people, floors are for cats. Buddy hopped down from the counter, padded across the floor, and, without hesitation, jumped straight into the empty chair. Then he sat upright, wrapping his tail neatly around his paws, staring right at George. You're a smart aleck, George muttered, hiding a smile behind his coffee mug. Buddy purred deeply, as if satisfied with his own defiance. The days turned into a sort of comedy routine. Every rule George invented, Buddy found a loophole. No animals on the table. Buddy claimed the windowsill. No animals in the recliner. Buddy perched on the armrest instead. Each evening became a negotiation. You're worse than raising a teenager, George said one night, as Buddy sprawled half across his lap. At least teenagers sleep in. Buddy lifted his head, gave a short merp, and pressed his forehead into George's chin. All right. But don't think flattery gets you everywhere. That same evening, George found the old photo album Ruth had kept. It was tucked behind the bookshelf, edges curling from years of heat and time. He brought it to the table, flipping through pictures of summer picnics, Ruth's garden, and family Christmases long past. Buddy climbed onto the table, sniffed at the pages, and stopped when George pointed to a photo of Ruth holding a tray of pies. "That's her," George said quietly. "The boss lady. You'd have loved her pies." Buddy touched the picture gently with his paw, then looked up at George with a soft chirp, as if asking where she'd gone. George swallowed hard. "She's gone, pal. Been a while now." The bobcat pressed closer, tail flicking once, and rested his chin on George's arm. It wasn't the kind of comfort words could offer. It was quieter, deeper. For the first time in months, George didn't feel the urge to shut the album. He left it open on the table, like it belonged there again. The next morning, he woke to find Buddy pawing at the same page, nudging it gently. George chuckled. "You miss her too, huh?" The bobcat made a soft sound, like agreement. It was around then that Mabel started stopping by more often. She'd come under the excuse of checking on that wild creature, but always stayed for coffee. One afternoon, she caught George trying to train Buddy to sit before meals. She stood at the door, arms crossed, grinning. "George Miller, are you seriously giving lessons to a bobcat?" "Grandson," George corrected, straight-faced. "He's family." Buddy, right on cue, chirped twice and sat perfectly upright. Mabel laughed so hard she had to lean against the door frame. "Well, I'll be. Maybe I should enroll too." "Sorry, class is full," George said. "Students with fur get priority." Mabel brought over another pie the following Sunday, peach this time. When she handed it to George, Buddy patted over, sniffed it, and chirped approvingly. Mabel grinned. "See, he's got taste. He likes me." George rolled his eyes. "He likes everyone who brings sugar." But there was something in the way Mabel's eyes softened each time she looked at Buddy. Like she saw in him what George had come to feel, a small miracle that made the house less empty. That evening, the three of them sat by the fire. Mabel on the couch, George in his recliner, and Buddy sprawled across both their feet like a living rug. The snow fell quietly outside, and the warmth of the stove filled the room. "You know," Mabel said, sipping her tea, "I think that cat's doing you some good." George smiled faintly. "He's a handful." "Maybe. But you're smiling again. Haven't seen that in years." Buddy lifted his head, chirped once, and then rested it back down. "See, even he agrees," Mabel said. When she left later that night, George stood on the porch watching her walk down the snowy path. The porch light cast long shadows, and Buddy sat beside him, tail curling around his boots. "You did good today," George said softly. "You make this place feel alive." The bobcat answered with a short, musical rumble, pressing against his leg. As the days passed, Buddy began following George everywhere. Into the shed, the woodpile, even the small greenhouse Ruth once tended. The plants had long since died, but Buddy would sniff at the empty pots and glance up at George with an expectant look, as if asking when he'd start again. "You think I should?" George said one morning. "Grow something again?" Buddy chirped 3 times, quick and decisive. "Guess that's a yes." By the end of the week, George had cleared the old shelves, swept the floor, and ordered seed packets online, something he hadn't done since Ruth's last spring. Every evening, he'd talk to Buddy while sorting through the packets. "Tomatoes for her," he'd say. "Mint for you so your breath doesn't scare off Mabel." Buddy would answer with a playful swat of his paw, claws carefully sheathed. It was in those quiet nights that George realized what had changed. The silence that once weighed heavy now carried a heartbeat. The sound of claws on wood, the rustle of fur against his chair, the occasional soft trill that broke the stillness just enough. He found himself humming again, old songs Ruth used to love. When he stopped mid-tune, Buddy would chirp twice, as if reminding him of the next line. And when Tom called one evening to check in, George found himself saying something that surprised even him. "Yeah, the house is fine," he said, "and I'm fine too. The boy keeps me busy." Tom laughed on the other end. "The boy?" "Buddy," George said. "Your brother, apparently." Tom groaned. "Dad, please don't start a family tree." But George just smiled. "Too late, son. We already had family dinner." After hanging up, he looked down at Buddy, who was curled on his lap, purring softly. "We sure did, didn't we, kid?" Buddy's eyes flickered open, gold in the firelight, and he let out a slow, contented chirp. Outside, the snow fell heavier now, blanketing the world in white. Inside, an old man sat humming beside his wild grandson, the warmth of the stove painting the walls amber. The house that had once echoed with absence now breathed like something alive. And for the first time in years, George Miller didn't count the hours until bedtime. He counted the moments of laughter instead. The first real snowstorm of the season came without much warning. One night the wind was only a whisper, and by dawn it had turned into a restless howl that sent drifts tumbling across the porch. George stood by the window, coffee steaming in his hand, watching flakes chase each other down from the heavy sky. The world beyond the glass looked softer somehow, like someone had laid a white blanket over every sharp edge. Buddy sat on the back of the couch, his gaze fixed on the swirling snow. His tail twitched once, twice. Then he chirped sharply, as if giving the weather his approval. "Yeah, looks pretty," George said. "You'll like it better from inside." The Bobcat gave a doubtful grunt and padded toward the door. George shook his head. "Don't even think about it. You're not built for this kind of mess." But Buddy had never been good at taking orders. When George went to fetch another log for the fire, the door cracked open behind him, a draft sneaking in before he could stop it. By the time he turned around, Buddy was gone. The tracks were easy to spot, 2 neat rows of paw prints heading straight for the trees. The snow was deep enough that each step left a perfect mold. George pulled on his coat, cursed softly under his breath, and followed. The forest behind the cabin was familiar ground, but that morning it felt different. The air hummed with cold. Every breath stung. His boots sank through the powder, crunching into the frozen dirt below. "Buddy," he called, voice echoing through the pines. Nothing. Only the wind. He tried again. "You hear me, boy? Get your spotted tail back here." A faint chirp answered from somewhere ahead, muffled and quick. Relief shot through him. "There you are." He trudged toward the sound, heart thudding, snow soaking into the cuffs of his jeans. Buddy appeared a moment later, crouched under a low pine bough, his fur dusted white. He looked both proud and guilty, like a child caught sneaking cookies. "What were you thinking?" George scolded, bending down. "You'll freeze your whiskers off." Buddy gave a short trill, low and almost apologetic, then turned and trotted deeper into the woods. "Oh, no, you don't," George muttered, following. "We're going home." The trees thickened, the light dimming as clouds rolled overhead. The path they'd made disappeared under falling snow. George's breath came out in quick clouds now, his knees stiff, his hand gripping a low branch to steady himself. Buddy stopped near the creek, a thin ribbon of black water threading through white banks. He pawed at the edge, ears twitching. George squinted. Something shiny was tangled in the reeds. "Now what have you found?" he asked. He stepped closer and saw a small metal tag glinting, one of the markers Ruth had tied there years ago to mark her garden boundary. He hadn't been down here since she passed. The sight of it caught him off guard, like a ghost he hadn't expected to meet. He reached for it, brushing snow away, but his foot slid on the icy bank. Before he could catch himself, he went down hard, landing in the cold with a grunt. Pain shot through his knee. The world tilted, spun. "Well, that's just perfect," he muttered through clenched teeth. Buddy yowled, a sound George had never heard from him before, sharp and frightened. The bobcat bounded forward, sniffed at George's jacket, then pressed his head against the man's shoulder as if trying to push him up. "I'm fine," George said, wincing. "Just give me a second." But he wasn't fine. The knee throbbed, and the cold was working fast through his clothes. He managed to sit upright and looked around. The snow was falling harder now, thick and steady, erasing their footprints. "Buddy," he said softly, "we're in a bit of trouble, aren't we?" The bobcat trilled anxiously and began pacing in small circles. Every few seconds he looked back at George, his ears flattened, eyes bright with worry. Then, without warning, he bounded off into the trees. "Buddy, get back here!" George yelled. The only answer was the crunch of paws fading into the distance. He cursed under his breath again, trying to pull himself up. The pain in his leg flared, and he sank back down. He sat there, breathing hard, watching the sky turn grayer. Minutes passed, maybe more. The forest had that eerie stillness that comes before evening, when every sound seems to wait. Then, faintly, there was movement through the snow. Buddy was coming back, and he wasn't alone. The bobcat darted through the trees, yowling loud enough to wake the dead. Behind him came the distant barking of Mabel's dog, Rusty, the big golden retriever she'd adopted after her husband died. A moment later, Mabel herself appeared, wrapped in a red coat and snow boots, flashlight in hand. "George Miller," she shouted. "Are you trying to give the whole neighborhood a heart attack?" "Only you," he managed, smiling weakly. She slogged over and knelt beside him. "You're lucky that cat came for me. Scratched at my door like a maniac." Buddy stood between them, tail flicking, letting out a long, anxious purr. With Mabel's help, George got to his feet. They made the slow trek back to the cabin, Buddy trotting ahead and checking over his shoulder every few steps like a nervous guide. When they reached the porch, the fire inside still glowed through the window, casting a soft orange light on the snow. Mabel helped him to the recliner. "You twisted it good," she said, examining the swelling knee. "You'll need to stay off it for a few days." "Good thing I've got a nurse," he said, nodding toward Buddy. The bobcat had climbed into the corner of the room, pacing once before settling down with a long sigh. He looked exhausted, ears drooping. George reached out and scratched behind one of them. "You did good, pal. Real good." Buddy closed his eyes, purring deep, the sound vibrating through the quiet room. Mabel smiled softly. "He really loves you, doesn't he?" George looked at her, then at the animal curled beside his chair. "Guess we found each other," he said quietly. That night, when Mabel left, the snow had stopped. George limped to the porch, Buddy close behind. The world glowed silver under the moonlight. Their tracks from earlier were already half filled, fading like a story nearly finished. "You saved my hide today," George said. "Don't think I don't know it." Buddy gave a single chirp, the sound gentle but firm, as if to say, "Of course I did." George chuckled, patting the railing. "You're not just a wildcat anymore, are you? You're family." The bobcat leaned against his leg, fur warm against the cold air. Together they watched the snow sparkle across the dark field until the wind grew still again. When they finally went inside, the fire crackled low, throwing gold light across the walls. George eased into his chair, Buddy curling on the rug near his feet. The storm was gone, the cabin quiet once more, but not empty. For the first time in years, George felt the peace that comes when you stop fighting the world and start letting it in. The wild had found its way into his home, and maybe into his heart too. The days after the storm felt almost unreal, like the world had slowed down just to give them time to breathe. George's knee was still stiff, but he could hobble around fine with the help of an old walking stick he'd found in the corner of the shed. Buddy followed him everywhere, shadow, guardian, and comic relief all in one. Every time George sat down, the Bobcat stationed himself nearby, tail curled neatly, eyes half closed but always alert. The cabin had settled into a new rhythm. Mabel stopped by with soup, pretending she didn't just want to check on her favorite patient. Tom called twice a week, half worried, half amused by his father's growing attachment to what he still insisted was a wild animal. "You sound happier, Dad," Tom said once. "Just don't forget he's not a person." George laughed into the phone. "You sure about that? He complains like one." Buddy, lying nearby, let out a chirp that sounded suspiciously like agreement. But then, one cold morning in December, everything shifted. The call came while George was pouring coffee, the cabin still quiet except for the pop of the stove. The number on the screen was unfamiliar. He answered, half expecting it to be a wrong number. "Mr. Miller," a woman's voice said. "This is Megan from the Cascade Wildlife Rehabilitation Center. I believe you've been caring for one of our rescues? A bobcat named Buddy?" George froze, the mug halfway to his lips. "That's right," he said slowly. "I wanted to thank you again for taking him in," she continued. "The new facility's finally finished, and we're beginning transfers for our permanent residents. We'd like to arrange to pick him up next week." The words hung in the air like frost. George sat down at the table. "Next week," he repeated. "Yes, sir. You've done a wonderful job. We can tell he's thriving. I'm sure it's bittersweet. But this new enclosure will give him more space, other animals to interact with." He stopped listening. His eyes had drifted to the hearth where Buddy lay curled in front of the fire, purring softly. The idea of that warmth gone from the cabin left a hollowness he couldn't quite name. When the woman paused, he cleared his throat. "All right," he said. "You'll call when you're on the way." "Yes, sir. Thank you again." After she hung up, George sat staring at the phone for a long while. Then he set it down gently and whispered, "Well, kid, looks like your vacation's over." Buddy lifted his head at the sound of his voice, blinking sleepily. "You heard me," George said, forcing a smile. "You'll be moving out soon. Some big fancy place with new friends and all the raw rabbit you can eat." The bobcat stood, stretched, and padded closer. He pressed his forehead against George's knee and purred harder, a low rumble that vibrated through the old man's bones. "Don't do that," George murmured. "You're not making this easier." From that day on, Buddy seemed to sense something had changed. He followed George even closer, talking more than ever. Soft, rolling chirps that filled the quiet hours. When George tried to write a grocery list, Buddy would bat at the pencil. When he read the newspaper, Buddy sat squarely on it. "You're a terrible assistant," George grumbled, and Buddy responded with a trill so sweet it made him laugh, despite himself. But as the week went on, George noticed a new pattern. At night, when the fire burned low, Buddy would wander from room to room, pausing at every corner, every chair, every photograph. It was as though he was memorizing the place. Once, George caught him sitting by the window, staring at the reflection of them both, man and Bobcat side by side in the glass. "You don't want to go either, do you?" George asked softly. Buddy's tail flicked, once, twice. Then he made a noise George had never heard before, a small, mournful chirp that faded into silence. The next day, Mabel stopped by again with a loaf of bread. She found George sitting by the fire, absently stroking Buddy's fur. "You look like a man who's just lost something," she said gently. He told her about the call. When he finished, she sighed. "Well, maybe that's how it's supposed to be. He came when you needed him. Maybe now it's time for him to help someone else." George frowned. "Maybe. But I don't think I'm done needing him yet." Mabel smiled sadly. "You always did get attached quick. Guess I never learned to stop." For the next few days he tried to prepare himself. He even fixed Buddy's old crate, tightening the latch, smoothing the wood. But each hammer tap felt heavier than the last. Buddy, as if protesting, kept curling up in his lap whenever he sat down to rest, his weight both comforting and unbearable. The night before the center was supposed to call again, snow began to fall thick and fast. The wind rattled the windows. George fed the stove and sat beside it. Buddy stretched across his feet. "You know," George said quietly, "I used to think I was done with taking care of things. Thought I'd earned my rest. But you," he shook his head, "you proved me wrong." Buddy's eyes half closed, his purr a deep, steady hum. The phone rang again, Tom this time. "Dad," Tom said, "Megan from the center called me. She wanted to make sure you're ready for tomorrow." George hesitated. "I heard." There was a pause. "You okay with it?" "Not sure," George admitted. "Feels like saying goodbye to part of the house." Tom's voice softened. "You've done more for that animal than anyone expected. Maybe that's the point, you know? Sometimes we only borrow the things that fix us." George didn't answer. After they hung up, he stayed there in the glow of the fire. Buddy lifted his head, blinked slowly, then climbed up onto the chair beside him. George let him. "Borrowed or not," he said, "you're mine tonight." The snow thickened through the night, piling high against the windows. By morning, the road into town was nearly buried. The rescue truck never came. When George called, the center said they'd have to postpone. "Road closures," Megan explained. "Maybe next week." He hung up without saying much, a guilty relief spreading through his chest. Buddy, as if reading his thoughts, gave a triumphant chirp and leapt into his lap, pressing his head under George's chin. All right, George laughed, voice cracking. "You win another week." Mabel came by that afternoon to bring groceries, and when George told her the news, she only smiled. "Looks like fate's on your side, old man," he chuckled. "Maybe just on his." That evening, when the storm quieted, George sat on the porch wrapped in a blanket. Buddy sat beside him, tail twitching in the cold air. The sky had cleared enough to show the first stars, faint and steady. "You ever think maybe you were sent here for a reason?" George asked. "To remind me how to live again." Buddy tilted his head, eyes bright in the starlight. Then he gave a low, rumbling purr that rolled through the quiet like an answer too simple and too true to need words. Inside, the fire waited. The two of them sat there a while longer, the snow glowing silver around them. And though George knew that phone would ring again someday soon, for now there was only peace. The kind that comes when you stop counting borrowed time and start living what's left of it. The storm rolled in at dusk like a heavy animal pushing against the hills. By supper time, the sky had gone the color of pewter, and the wind had a mean edge to it, the sort that slides under doors and rattles picture frames. George fed the stove a pair of thick cedar rounds and watched the flames take hold. When the lamp flickered once, twice, he said, "Don't you start." And the lamp, being a lamp, did what it wanted. The house went dark with a soft pop, and the world shrank to firelight. "All right," he told the room. "We've done this before." He moved slow but sure, finding the drawer with the candles, the box with the fat flashlight, whose batteries he checked the first day of every month because habits like that keep a man honest. Buddy hovered close, eyes throwing back little coins of gold from the fire. When the wind hit the porch head-on, the Bobcat answered with a sharp trill, part complaint, part dare. "Nothing out there but cold," George said, setting a candle on the table. "We'll wait it out." The snow came harder after 9, hitting the windows like handfuls of sand. The cabin creaked and settled, a ship in a tight sea. George made tea because tea gives a man something to do with his hands. He brought the mug to his chair and sat slow, the knees still not right from the creek spill. Buddy took his usual post on the arm like a ridiculous velvet statue, and then, deciding formality didn't suit the evening, slid down across George's lap with a grunt. The old man let the weight sit there and felt his breath follow the Bobcat's steady rise and fall. Outside, the wind worked itself into a full sermon. Near 10, he felt the first wrong flutter. It was small, a moth against a screen, easy to ignore if a man wanted to. He set the mug down anyway. "Hold on," he told his own chest as if reason could bargain with a heart. Buddy lifted his head at once, ears pricked, eyes brighter. "I'm fine," George said, because that's what men say. The second flutter came larger, the moth now a trapped bird. A tightness climbed up behind his breastbone and spread across his shoulders like wet cloth. He tried shifting in the chair. He tried taking a breath so deep it would clear him out. The breath wouldn't go where it should. Buddy rose and planted both front paws against his sweater, not claws, but insistence. The Bobcat's voice, when it came, was not one of his daytime jokes. It was a low, urgent sound, a string of trills and clicks that made the hair on George's arms stand up. "Easy," George told him, though the word came thin and far away. He reached for the arm of the chair and missed it by inches. The room tilted. The fire hopped sideways in the box like a startled fox. Buddy's next move was pure decision. He butted George's chin until the old man met his eyes, then leapt down, bolted to the door, and threw his whole weight against it. The latch held. He spun, darted back, and jumped to the table where the flashlight lay, knocking it to the floor so it clattered loud in the dark. He grabbed the cord of George's robe with his teeth and tugged, a ridiculous, desperate little pull that somehow brought George back to himself. "Okay," George whispered. "Okay, kid." He tried to stand and the room went narrow and bright at the edges. He sank back, breathing shallow, willing his chest to behave. "Mabel," he said, the name escaping like a prayer. "Go get Mabel." Buddy didn't need a second asking. He sprang to the door again, raked at the latch until it jumped, then shouldered the gap he made. A wave of night spilled in, cold, sharp, tasting of iron. For a heartbeat, he looked back, the way he always did, checking. George lifted 2 fingers in a little go-on. The Bobcat was gone into the storm, swallowed by it in 3 bounds. George sat with his hand pressed flat against his sweater, counting the beats he could find and the ones he couldn't. The fire dipped. He watched it and kept his breath shallow and steady, the way they taught him years ago when a flight test went wrong and he had to ride out a long minute with instruments that didn't make sense. He thought then of Ruth, of the quiet way she'd set a hand to his forearm and say, "Breathe with me, George." He tried to find her rhythm in the old wood clock's stubborn tick. Buddy ran the short distance to Mabel's place in a world turned white and roaring. Snow stacked on his whiskers and iced his ear tufts, but he kept his line, low and fast, reading the wind the way a creature born to the brush knows how. He hit her porch like a thrown coat, scrambled up, and threw his body at the door. Inside, Rusty, the golden retriever, barked his deep church bell bark. Buddy answered with a jagged yowl unlike any he'd used in the easy hours, a sound with a hook in it. Mabel opened to a flurry of fur and night. "Good Lord," she said, grabbing the doorknob as the wind tried to steal it. Buddy backed up, trilled, spun, and tore down the steps, then wheeled and looked at her hard. The old rules of language are old because they work. She understood. "Rusty, stay," she told the dog, a command he obeyed only because he could tell there was a different job tonight. She grabbed her parka, the flashlight, the little hand-crank radio that sometimes caught the county band, and followed the cat. The path between houses had disappeared. Buddy cut a seam through the drifts, and Mabel trusted his insistence. Twice he stopped and ran back to her, chittering urgently, then shot forward again. At George's door she pounded once and didn't wait, pushing into the dim room where the candle wobbled and the fire sulked and George sat too still. "Hey now," she said, voice steady in the way that makes other people steady. "You picked quite a night for drama." She was beside him before he could finish a half smile. "Chest?" He nodded. "Radiating?" He made a seesaw with his hand. "All right." She set the radio on the table, wound furiously, and got lucky enough to catch the emergency channel. Roads were a mess, but there was a unit not far with chains on. Buddy jumped to the back of the chair, then down to the floor, then up again, unable to keep his feet still. He pressed against George's calf and held there, purring a note that ran like a line through the noise. "You're okay," Mabel told George. Not as a wish, but a plan. She found the aspirin, brought water, measured out calm with every motion of her hands. Outside, the siren was the faintest smear in the wet dark, then nearer, then near enough to feel in the boards. The EMTs came in with the storm on their coats, 2 young men and a woman whose eyes took the room in one sweep. They moved the way practiced people do, quick and kind. Oxygen, leads, a cuff squeezing a number out of a stubborn artery. "Evening, Mr. Miller," the woman said. "We're going to help your heart settle down." He tried to joke and couldn't find it, so he gave her a look that said, "Thanks for trying," and she nodded like she'd heard the joke anyway. Buddy did not leave the chair. When the blood pressure cuff hissed, he flinched, then pressed closer. When the oxygen cannula clicked into place, he sniffed at the line, satisfied himself it was doing what it should, and sat. One of the men reached a hand out, thought better of it, and let it hover near the Bobcat's shoulder like a promise. They got George onto the gurney just as the wind found a new gear. "Road's passable if we take the long loop," the driver called. "We'll have to creep it." Mabel had her coat on already. "I'm coming behind you," she told them. "He's not walking into that ER alone." The team didn't argue. They'd learned not to argue with people who had that tone. At the door, George turned his head to find Buddy. The Bobcat stood at the threshold, as if a line had been drawn there that even wildness wouldn't cross. He made a sound so soft it was almost nothing, the syllable of a question and an answer together. George lifted his hand, palm out, the old signal you give a child on his first day of school. Back soon, he managed. You hold the fort. Buddy flattened his ears once, a tiny protest, then bumped his forehead against George's knuckles with exaggerated care, as if not to disturb a single wire. When the door shut, he sat there, listening until the siren thinned to a thread and was gone. Then he turned to the fire, found the spot where George's boots always rested, and curled his body into the shape the boots made. The cabin breathed around him, the wind testing and retreating, the stove ticking, the clock insisting. He did not sleep. He kept his engine running. In the ER, light was everywhere. White, hard, awake. The monitors painted little green hills. A nurse with a voice like a favorite song said his name every few minutes so it wouldn't wander. The doctor talked to him the way people talk to men who have spent a lifetime fixing things. Here's what's loose. Here's what we're tightening. Here's how we'll watch it. Mabel sat in the plastic chair and knitted nothing with her hands, pulling and looping the air. When they stepped out to change a bag, she leaned over the rail. You scared me, she said. Don't make a habit of it. I'll pencil that in, he said, and found the joke after all. The small machines made approving little beeps. Toward dawn, the worst of the storm burned out over the far ridge. The ambulance drove him back through a world scraped clean and hushed. The sun found the edges of every drift and lit them up like new porcelain. Mabel's old sedan trailed behind, faithful as a farm dog. They eased him inside, settled him in the chair, went over instructions he would forget and remember by feel. When the door closed and the quiet came, Buddy emerged from the shadow by the stove, tall and careful, like a guard coming off duty. He climbed first to the footstool, then to the arm of the chair, then eased his head under George's hand with the softest push. The purr started low and stitched itself into the air. Hey kid, George said, voice rough but steady. You did it. Buddy blinked, slow and solemn, then made a low sound George had never heard before. A little ribbon of notes that rose and fell like a lullaby. Mabel stood in the doorway with her coat half on and watched them with a smile that had tired at the edges. I'll bring breakfast later, she said. Doctor's orders. She paused. I've never seen anything like that. The way he came for me. The way he watched you. Grandson manners, George said. Raised him myself. She shook her head and laughed in that watery way that happens after a long night. You too, she said, and let the door close soft behind her. The house took a deep breath. The kettle, stubborn as ever, started to sing on the back heat of the stove. George rested his palm on the warm dome of Buddy's head and felt, underneath fur and bone, the bright, steady thrum of a life that had chosen his. Outside, the plow would come eventually, and the phone would ring eventually, and the world would resume its habit of asking for things. For now, the only sound that mattered was the Bobcat's steady engine and the old man's answer to it. Two rhythms finding each other and settling into one. Spring crept back into the Oregon hills, the way old friends come through the door, slow, familiar, without asking for permission. The snow melted in quiet sighs along the ditches, and the creek behind George's cabin ran quick and restless again. For the first time in months, the air carried a scent that wasn't firewood or frost. It smelled like green things remembering themselves. George stood on the porch that morning with a cup of coffee and a blanket across his shoulders. The doctors had said he'd come through a warning, not a sentence. He'd spent a week under the humming lights of the hospital, another week under Mabel's suspiciously watchful eye, and now he was home, alive, grateful, and softer somehow. Buddy sat beside him on the railing, tail flicking, the very picture of smug contentment. "You're awful pleased with yourself," George said. The bobcat chirped twice, proud and matter-of-fact. "Yeah, well, I suppose you've earned it." A little wind stirred through the trees, tossing the first new buds on the branches. For a long while they just stood there, an old man and a wild creature watching the world start over again. The news of Buddy's heroics had spread faster than a brush fire through the valley. The EMTs had told the story, and soon half the county knew about the bobcat who'd saved his owner by banging on a neighbor's door. Folks started dropping by just to meet the little doctor. One ranger even brought a plaque that read, "For outstanding instinct and bravery in service of a human life." George hung it crookedly above the mantel, right beside Ruth's photo. "She'd have liked you," George said one evening, "though she might have insisted you eat at the table properly." Buddy trilled softly, stretching out across the rug like he owned the place, which, in a way, he did. Mabel stopped by almost every day now. "Just checking your blood pressure," she claimed, though she always brought biscuits for the patient. Buddy would meet her at the porch steps, chirping in welcome. She pretended not to like him, but always ended up scratching under his chin until he went cross-eyed with pleasure. "You two are a sight," she said one afternoon, watching George and Buddy sitting shoulder to shoulder on the porch, both staring at a pair of blue jays squabbling in the yard. "Like an old married couple." "Don't insult the cat," George said, and Buddy made a noise that sounded suspiciously like laughter. Life found its pace again. George tended the small greenhouse he'd revived before the storm, planting the tomato seeds Buddy had helped scatter all over the floor. Each morning, the bobcat followed him through the rows, watching intently as if supervising construction. Every so often he'd press a paw into the soil, leaving a neat little print that George never smoothed out. Tom came up from Portland one weekend, bringing Ethan along. The boy ran through the door calling, "Grandpa!" and froze at the sight of Buddy sitting calmly by the stove. "He really is still here," Ethan whispered, grinning. Buddy chirped in greeting, then padded over and brushed against the boy's legs, purring like a small tractor. Tom shook his head. "I'll be damned. I thought you'd have sent him back by now." "Was supposed to," George said. "Storms kept getting in the way. Fate's got a stubborn streak." They all sat on the porch that afternoon, telling the story of the night the bobcat saved the old man. Tom laughed until tears rolled down his cheeks. Ethan leaned against George's arm, and Buddy sat between them like the hero he was, occasionally trilling as though correcting minor details in the tale. When the sun dipped low, painting the trees with gold, George leaned back in his chair and sighed. "You know, I spent years thinking quiet was peace. Turns out I just needed someone to argue with." Buddy gave a short chirp, agreement or contradiction, it hardly mattered. The Wildlife Center called again a week later. The woman's voice was cheerful. "Mr. Miller, we're ready whenever you are. You've done wonders for Buddy." George looked across the room. Buddy was sprawled upside down in front of the fire, one paw twitching in a dream. He thought about the empty silence that used to sit in that spot. "He's done wonders for me too," he said finally. Maybe we'll hang on to each other a bit longer." The woman chuckled. "I think that's perfectly fine." The days kept stretching longer, the nights softer. The bobcat had grown larger, his coat brighter, but he still insisted on his morning coffee ritual, perched on the table, making low conversational hums while George read the paper. Sometimes Mabel joined them, rolling her eyes at their boy talk. One morning, as sunlight spilled through the window, Buddy pawed at the paper until George looked up. "What?" he asked. Buddy trilled twice, then leapt onto the chair beside him, sitting upright like a proper gentleman. George laughed. "You really do think you're my grandson, don't you?" The bobcat blinked slowly, then let out a chirp so perfectly timed it might have been yes. "Well," George said, reaching to scratch behind his ear, "you're the only one who listens when I tell stories, so I guess you are." That evening, Mabel brought supper over, roast chicken and mashed potatoes, and stayed to watch the sunset. The porch faced west, where the mountains caught the last light. Buddy sat in the extra chair, his favorite spot, tail wrapped neatly. "You two need a sign," she said. "Something that says Miller and Son." George chuckled. "Think we can get him to pay taxes first?" Buddy chirped loudly, as if joining the joke, and Mabel laughed so hard she had to wipe her eyes. The sky turned gold, then pink, then that deep blue that always made George think of Ruth's favorite quilt. For a long time, none of them spoke. The only sounds were the crickets starting up and Buddy's low purr, steady and content. George looked at the cat beside him, then at the empty chair where Ruth used to sit. "You know," he said softly, "I think she'd be happy I'm not sitting out here alone." Mabel reached over and patted his hand. "She'd be proud you finally let someone else take care of you." George nodded. "He's good at it. Loud, bossy, but good." The bobcat made a short murr-pee, then leaned his head against George's arm. The sun slipped completely behind the ridge, and the first stars appeared, tiny, stubborn lights refusing to go out. George felt Buddy's warmth against his side, heard the slow rhythm of that deep, healing purr, and realized something quiet but absolute. He wasn't lonely anymore. He glanced down at Buddy. "You saved me, you know. Not just that night, every day since." Buddy looked up, eyes gleaming like twin embers, and gave one last chirp, a sound that held both mischief and affection, the same way laughter sometimes hides tears. George smiled, the lines around his eyes soft. "Yeah," he said. "I love you too, kid." They sat there together on the porch, the old man, the bobcat, and the woman who refused to admit she cared, as the night folded gently around them. The air smelled of pine and new beginnings. From somewhere down the road came the faint echo of church bells. Inside the cabin, the plaque over the mantel caught the firelight, for outstanding instinct and bravery. Underneath it, George had taped a small piece of paper in his own shaky handwriting. It read simply, "Family comes in all shapes, even spotted ones. And if you happened to walk by that porch at sunrise, you'd see an old man and a bobcat sitting side by side, talking to each other like kin." The sound of their laughter carried down the hill, blending with the wind, proof that sometimes love doesn't need to make sense. It just needs to stay.